go out there and you put an offer in on a property, now you look at it, it looks nice. You know, it's looking good, you don't know. But you really don't know. I'm not a structural engineer. Most buyers aren't either. You know, we don't know, you know, if the roof is really that good. We stand there and look at it, it looks okay. We don't know if the plumbing's okay, if the AC works good. So we're going to go out, and we talked about this a couple of series back, how the importance of getting the property inspected. So within this time frame, we're going to go out and we're going to get an inspector, a professional inspector, to come out and inspect the property. Now this is something the buyer has to pay for, usually between $300 to $400 on a normal residential property. But again, it's money well spent. Because now you go out there and you get it inspected. This inspector's going to go out and go through the property. It usually takes an average size home, say a 2,000, 2,500 square foot house. It's going to take 2.5 to 3 hours to go through your house. At this point, the buyer is under no obligation to purchase still, because he's still in that option period, isn't he? The seller is obligated to sell it to him at the agreed price, but the buyer is not obligated to buy during this time frame. So what happens is, and most people understand this, you end up renegotiating a lot of times, because remember, he's buying it as is. So now the buyer gets this report, he gets with his agent, and they sit down and figure out what's important, what needs to be done, or if the property's in good shape. At that point, your agent, your buyer's agent, goes back to work for you again. Goes back and you draw up what we call an amendment to the contract, stating that we want different things. We want this fixed, or we want them to do this, or possibly lower the price because it needed more repairs than we thought, or possibly we want some kind of cash settlement at closing from the seller to pay for these things after we purchase the house as the buyer. There's many different ways you can approach it. Of course, remember, we do have a contract. The seller is under no obligations to fix anything, is he? But now he's got this report. The buyer comes back and says, I want these things fixed, and I want you to give me $1,000 additional money at closing. This is just an example. The seller's under no obligation to do that whatsoever. But the key is, the buyer at this point is still under no obligation to buy. So we kind of have a little standoff here, don't we?
That's right.
Okay? So if the seller doesn't want to fix these things or do some kind of other concessions, the buyer doesn't have to buy. He can simply cancel the contract, get his earning money back, and move on to another house, couldn't he?
That's right.
The seller understands that. Now, the seller doesn't have to fix it, but usually what happens is it's a little give and take. We ask for this, the seller says, I'll do this. You know, we go back and forth, negotiate this out. And we usually, most cases, come to some kind of agreement so we can move forward with the transaction, right? But they don't have to. But here's the situation with the seller. If the seller doesn't do it, puts it back on the market, guess what the next buyer is going to do? He's going to have the property inspected, isn't he?
That's right.
And when he gets it inspected, he's going to find the same issues with the property, isn't he?
That's it.
And the next buyer is probably going to want some kind of concessions. He's going to lower the price or fix these things or do something. Maybe not. Every buyer's different. But more than likely, it's going to happen all over again. So what you've got in this situation is, if you're reasonable, if your buyer is reasonable with the seller would usually do some kind of repairs, do some kind of concessions to make the thing work within reason.
Right.
Makes sense, doesn't it? Because he's going to run into this problem anyway, correct?
Unless he's hoping that the next buyer isn't going to do that.
Well, it is such common practice nowadays. I said this earlier. An inspection is not required by the mortgage company, the title company, by anybody. It's not a required item at this point. But anybody that's purchasing a house, I can't tell you how important it is to have this inspection done. Okay? So, more than likely, and it's getting to be common practice now, that most everybody has it done. So, if this is true, more than likely the seller's going to sit and run into the same issues next time.
That's correct.
So you can see where we're at. The seller doesn't have to fix anything, but the buyer doesn't have to buy. So it kind of forces everybody to get back together and renegotiate, doesn't it?
Right.
And that's where your agent comes back in for you again. You're going to step you through this process, help you renegotiate, look at what needs to be repaired or whatever we need to do. Now, one thing I do need to state here, you need to understand, if you're buying a house built in 1983, when this inspector comes out and inspects the property, he's going to find several things wrong with the house. It's almost 25 years old, isn't it? And it's going to have some issues, as I call them. And you can't expect it to be a new home. So the buyer has to be reasonable here too. The inspector will inspect that property at today's codes, what we call building codes, 2007s. You can't expect the seller to go in and spend $20,000 bringing it up to today's code. Because when the house was built back in '82, whenever I said, it met codes at that point. So the buyer needs to be reasonable here too. You can't just go and get it inspected and then just give the inspection report to the seller and says, I want everything fixed. Okay? There's going to be things that just don't make sense to fix.
Right.
And they've been that way for 20 years, so let's not, they obviously work, right? So, I mean, that's just something to keep in mind. And I always let my buyers know that in the beginning, that when the inspection's done, that inspector is going to really do a thorough job. But you can't expect the seller to fix every little thing.
Right.
That's just unreasonable.
Now, if you're reasonable in all this situation, and we were talking also about option periods and things of that
Right.
nature, then it's reasonable to conclude that if all these things work out according to inspection and they come to a reasonable conclusion about things, then the option period will then be fulfilled. The
correct.
guy won't need to worry about opting out of the deal,
Right.
and he can go forward and go
Yeah,
ahead and close the deal.
The option period will either just run its course, the time frame, okay, and then we will proceed on to the next step toward closing. But normally the way it's done, let's say I get it inspected and I have 3 days left on my option period, in return for the seller agreeing to fix these things, then I will waive the rest of the option period. Okay, I'll say, okay, I'll go ahead and terminate the option agreement. We'll go ahead and waive the other 3 days that I have left if you agree to do these. That assuring the seller I'm not going to go back in 2 more days and ask for more stuff. So it kind of works together, doesn't it? Again,
It shows you can negotiate on almost every
you got-
level right down
yeah. So in most cases, you end up negotiating twice: the original contract,
Yeah.
and again during that option period.
Now the agents are involved in helping their respective clients the whole time,
Exactly.
and that makes it a smoother process when
Yes.
you've got people that actually know what's going on in the real estate
Well, yeah.
business.
I look at agents as a buffer. Okay, if you put buyers and sellers together, a lot of times, they start getting animosity, I guess,
Yeah, that's
against
what-
each other. And the agents kind of are the buffers between it, keeping it all more on a business level.
Sort of like mediators.
Well, yeah, more or less, but yes, they're keeping everything to where everybody's, kind of an arm's length away from each other.
More of a professional atmosphere
That's
about
correct.
the whole
More on a
situation.
business level, more like that, and that's what it is. It is a business transaction. But there's a lot of emotions involved in
That's
purchasing.
right.
Buying or purchasing a home, selling your home. There's a lot of emotions.
That's why an agent can play such a good part in
Right.
dealing with the emotions that can arise in such a
Correct.
tremendous sale or purchase, depending on which side of the
Right.
fence you're on.
Right.